When you apply a transition in Vegas, a special video effects options screen will open on which you can set the parameters for your video transition. An important thing to understand about transitions is that they need transitional material. This is called head and tail footage that will come from each event on your timeline. And they need this to create the segment of the transition in which both events are on screen at the same time. And I'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment, but first let's look at basically how to add a transition between two events on your timeline. As you might guess, you simply go to the Transitions menu here on the tabbed interface, and we select a transition. So for instance, I can choose 3D fly in and out, and I can see previews of each one of my transitions simply by hovering my mouse over them. That's a pretty cool transition. And I could drag it to my timeline here where there's an intersection of two events. And it creates, by default, a 1-second transition. Now, I can do a lot of modification of that transition. Let's move the playhead here over the transition so we can see what's going on. You can see the one scene flipping over to create the next, right? From the preset menu, I can select a couple of different options. These are exactly the same presets, by the way, as you will see over here in the transitions panel. So whatever transition you pick, whatever category of transition you pick, you will always have the same options here for presets. And then, of course, you can change by using the sliders pretty much any of the characteristics of that transition simply by moving the sliders. You can see. All of these transitions have ways for you to modify them in any way you want. A specular, by the way, sometimes you see that word show up. Specular means a light source. So what we have is a 3D transition here, as if these clips were moving in three-dimensional space. A specular means that you will see like a light source on it, as if in the midst of turning in three-dimensional space, the light kind of hits it for a second. So that's called a specular, and you can control how much that specular hits this particular transition. And that's basically all there is to adding a transition. But now we have a challenge here. I'm going to zoom in on my timeline a little bit. I'm going to remove that transition simply by right-clicking on it and turning the transition back into a cut. So there I've removed my transition. When I do, you'll notice something. Look on the timeline there. You notice that one of the scenes has a little notch on it. And as we know from some of our previous movies here, that notch indicates the end of the clip. So our event is longer than the clip, and we know what happens when that happens. Depending on how you have your preferences set up, it may create a freeze frame, but more often what it's going to do is repeat the clip. So it gets to the end, and then it goes back to the beginning again. That can cause some unexpected and probably unwanted effects here to our movie. So if I play this, you will actually see it jump back to the beginning of the clip. You didn't see it so well there. I'm going to expand it even more to make it more obvious. Delete that clip for now. And if I expand this one, you can see. Well, in this particular case, my preferences must be set to freeze frame. You do have the option of setting it to freeze frame, or you have the option of setting it to repeat back to the beginning of the clip. Either way, you're getting something you didn't want. Your scene goes on longer than the actual clip. Now, why is that a danger, and why is that relevant to adding a transition? Let's grab my other clip and put it back on the timeline. I'm going to move this back to that notch so I'm at the end of my clip, and we'll drag the other clip down here. So now we have our events right next to each other on their timeline. This is a very important principle, and if you understand this, you'll understand why sometimes transitions drive you crazy. Both of these events on the timeline are at either the beginning or the end of the clip. If I extend this, you see I get a notch. If I extend this, you see I get a notch. There's no head or tail material. In other words, when I add my transition, if my transition is a second long, there's going to be half a second on either side of it in which both clips are on at the same time. Does that make sense? So in other words, we need an extra half second added on to the previous clip, and we need another half second added on to the oncoming clip, or to the new clip. If we don't, what we get is a freeze frame while the transition is happening. I'm going to put the spin away transition back on the timeline here so you can see. We'll add it between these two clips, or between these two events. We'll close it and watch, and you will see that the scene, you see those little notches on there, they're indicating it, that both scenes will actually freeze during the transition. So I'll press my L to play it.
I see.
That was very, very bad. We don't want that. That will drive you crazy. So before you add a transition, I'm going to Control Z to remove that. I recommend that you peel back about a second or trim back about a second between your clips. Trim back here, just about a second. You can do it half a second even, but a second will give you some safety room. Now, when I add my transition between the two clips and play it, you see that I'm not going to go after the end or before the beginning of the two clips that are on the timeline. There will be motion, there will be live activity amidst the transition. So I'm going to press L to play it. See that? That was a much more natural transition. Well, what if you don't want to do that? What if you don't want to always be having to trim back your videos in order to allow for head and tail material? I'll show you another way to do it. We'll Control Z to remove the transition again, and I'll Control Z here so that I have both clips on the timeline at once. The best way to do it is to use the automatic crossfade feature. And we've shown you this in a previous movie. Make sure automatic crossfades is toggled on here on your control panel, and then drag the two clips to create the segment of the transition. Like I say, by nature, by default, transitions are a second long. Now what I've done is I've overlapped the two. I'm essentially doing the same thing I would have done if I'd have trimmed back half a second on each clip. I now have the necessary head and tail material. I can now add a transition to this one of two ways, and that is either by right-clicking on it and selecting Transition, Other, and selecting here from my plug-in directory here for my list of transitions, or I can simply drag the transition from the transition panel onto this overlap, and when I let go, I now have a good, clean transition on my timeline. So transitions can be a fun way to take your audience from one scene to another. And some transitions are very showy and very obvious, and others are so subtle that your audience will hardly even notice them. Just remember that the transitions you select are going to kind of determine the style and tone of your movie. There are 25 sets of categories of transitions here that come bundled with the program, in addition to the new Blue plugins that are included with Vegas. And with this set, you will have the option of choosing whether your transition is very, very showy or very, very subtle.